Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you very much to Professor Bülent Erikal for this nice introduction. And thank you very much also to Roger Institute of Earth Sciences for having me today. I'm very happy that I can present my research to you today. The focus of my presentation today will be actually my ongoing postdoctoral project, which I'm working, as Bülent Hoca said, at the University of Bern and currently at the Swiss Institute in Rome. The project is centered on the island of Lipari, which is in the north of Sicily. You will also see later. Today, though, I will try to keep things a little bit broad since I know that most of you you're from different disciplines, and I will be drawing some examples from the Mediterranean to particularly from the Greek and Roman periods to try to provide a wider context. So natural disasters such as earthquakes have always had a big impact on how societies adapt and evolve at the same time. And by studying identity through an archaeoseismological approach, we can understand how these events influence the way people perceive themselves and also their environment. Earthquakes not only reshape physical spaces, but also have a power to shift the social identities. And this is where archaeoseismology plays an important role, as it links the material evidence with the cultural and social responses of the people to such disasters. Let's start with a fundamental question, of course. What is identity? Identity is a dynamic phenomenon. The term itself comes from the Latin word idem, and it means the same or sameness. So it reflects both the uniqueness of an individual and the shared characteristics of a group, often defined in contrast to others. This concept is important in archaeology. We explore it through material culture, through social practices, and historical context. Identity is not a static phenomenon. It is shaped by several things, by social norms, by environmental factors, by individual experiences as well. And societies with shared traditions accommodate individual differences, which are then reflected in personal ideologies and motivations. As such, identity is fluid and it continuously evolves as individuals and communities adapt to changing circumstances. Over time, the study of identity in archaeology has shifted, of course. Early approaches view it as fixed, focusing only on the material culture, but later approaches such as post-processual archaeology, for example, emphasize cultural dynamics and the variability of identity, so recognizing it as a context-dependent and evolving phenomenon. To better understand identity, we must also consider Pierre Bourdieu's concept of habitus. Habitus refers to the habits, skills, and dispositions that people develop over time that are shaped by their social environments. These are not conscious choices, but they rather reflect the social structures societies live in, individuals live in as well. So like be it their class, religion, their education, and as habitus becomes internalized, it shapes both individual behaviors and collective practices. Habitus is not chosen freely. It arises from past experiences and also present choices, present actions. It sustains sustaining, of course, social systems and values. And over time, habitus influences how individuals conform to, resist, or adapt to the cultural norms. So it's a process that is also clearly visible in the material culture, like objects, buildings, artifacts reflect the internalized practices of the people who created them, which offers us then an insight to their identities. This idea of habitus is particularly relevant to archaeoseismology, where material remains helps us to understand how communities respond to environmental challenges, such as earthquakes. So now, what is archaeoseismology? Let's discuss a little bit this. What does it mean and why is it important for identity studies? The word archaeoseismology comes from ancient Greek, archaeoseismos. It is the study of ancient earthquakes and the way societies responded to them. So it combines our geological data with archaeological evidence to reconstruct the history of seismic events. And by examining the physical remains of settlements, us archaeologists can have a better understanding of the changes in building techniques, settlement layouts, and other cultural responses to natural disasters. Earthquakes often lead to significant shifts in a society, not only in how people rebuild their physical environment, but also in how they adapt socially and culturally. Archaeoseismology, in that sense, helps us to understand not just the destruction caused by seismic events, but also the resilience and adaptation that followed. In this way, it can explain the process by which communities reshape their identities in response to natural crisis. Here, for example, we see a relief from the House of Caecilius in Pompeii that shows the effects of an earthquake that took place in 62. You can see the buildings leaning, some objects are falling, and mules are running away in fear. It's not just like a casual visual, but it reflects the experiences of the people who survived this earthquake. Meanwhile, we see a water structure that is undamaged. So we see like some buildings were maybe more resistant and some could stay like that. So this kind of reliefs are also very important in that sense. Of course, as we said, like earthquakes have various effects, including, I mean, as you know, like ground shaking, surface falls, secondary events like landslides to tsunamis. But the way the buildings respond to the seismic forces depends on several factors too, such as materials, construction techniques, and even at times the building's design. Flexible structures, for example, may endure minor shaking without much damage, while mortar-bound buildings may crack under stress. And the intensity of shaking can vary also greatly depending on local geological conditions, which helps explain why certain structure may suffer more damage than others, even if at times they are located nearby. So archaeoseismologists aim to determine not only if an earthquake occurred, but also to understand when it took place, how strong it was, and the characteristic of the seismic event. And by analyzing damage patterns across sites, archaeoseismologists can identify consistent signs of seismic activity. These patterns provide valuable clues that help establish a timeline and offer a more precise understanding of past events. While it can be, of course, challenging to pinpoint whether the damage results from a single event or multiple occurrences over time, archaeoseismology provides important insights to us into how societies experienced and responded to seismic threats. And my focus will be primarily, of course, on the archaeological aspects of this approach, with an emphasis on identity following these seismic events. The first phase of the methodology involves collecting primary data to characterize the sites and assess the evidence of past seismic impacts. This includes historical sources like ancient maps, cartographic records, and spatial data, of course. These sources provide valuable context, such as settlement patterns, infrastructure, and in some cases, they offer literary accounts that describe the effects of earthquakes. Historical texts don't provide direct physical evidence, but they can guide us towards places where seismic events may have occurred and helps us to narrow down our archaeological research. For example, there is Diodorus Siculus. He is a 1st century BC Greek historian, and he compiled a wide range of his stories and events in his Bibliotheca Historica. One particular account involves Gelon, a ruler of Sicily, who survived the disaster as a child. According to Diodorus, while Gelon was at school, a wolf stole his writing tablet. As Gelon chased the animal outside, an earthquake struck, collapsed the school, and killed over 100 students and their teacher. And other historians recount similar stories. We can also read this English translation together. Gelon was also saved from death by a wolf. As a boy, he was seated in a school, and a wolf came and snatched away the tablet he was using. And while he was chasing after the wolf itself and his tablet too, the school was shaken by an earthquake and crashed down from its very foundations, killing every one of the boys together with the teacher. Historians like Timaeus, Dionysius, Diodorus, and also Dio celebrate the number of the boys, which amounted to more than 100. The precise number, I do not know. Such historical accounts helps us to pinpoint areas where seismic activity may have occurred. So they provide us clues that lead us to archaeological research in these places. So they don't only guide us like in locating the evidence, but also gives us some insight in into the social and cultural impact of earthquakes of ancient communities. Next, we look at the archaeological data. This includes on-site surveys that identify evidence of seismic activity, such as tilted strata, dislocated foundations, collapsed architectural features like walls, roads, and evidence of sudden interruptions in the archaeological record, such as sudden abandonments, mass burials, can also suggest the occurrence of some sort of catastrophic events. Here we see a few examples from central Italy and Sicily that illustrate this kind of archaeological indicators. The first one here we see on the left is from Capo d'Orlando, a Roman villa. It shows the cracks across the floor and in the internal walls of the room. Here towards the right, you see the collapse of the northern colonnade of Temple C in Selinunte in Sicily. They all have fallen in the same direction, which must have been due to an external force, because in normal circumstances, you wouldn't see it falling all like that, or at least not very often. Here we see some other examples from the Eastern Mediterranean. Above the broken and scattered stones of the temple of Aphrodite, Euphrei, and Cnidus, modern Dacia, are shown, and below different destruction layers are visible. The first one, fallen columns, again, all oriented in the same direction. In B, we see a section of a wall that is partially intact with visible stones stacked in a methodical yet weathered pattern, which demonstrates a structural damage the building has endured. And in C, a collapsed wall with large blocks scattered around the base of the structure is seen. So this kind of a rubble suggests that a significant portion of a wall is fallen, likely due to a structural collapse, which could also be an indicator of a major event. Here in this slide, we see an example from Ostia Antica near Rome. Here, a pillar shows the pillar shown shows rotation around its vertical axis, which is also a phenomenon that would not occur under normal circumstances. The structure must have experienced significant vertical stress or shifting, like, for example, an earthquake in this case, because vertical ground motion and lateral forces can create enough stress to rotate or displace pillars like this one. Also, a detailed analysis of construction techniques is essential for understanding how ancient buildings withstood or relented to seismic forces. Certain architectural features are more vulnerable to seismic stress than others, like the pillar example we have just seen, for example, and these patterns can reveal the level of resilience and adaptation to the earthquakes. For instance, arcs and vaults, which are commonly used in ancient architecture and especially Roman period, they are particularly sensitive to seismic forces. These structures are under horizontal stress, which increases with the earthquake's proximity to the epicenter. And in the case of Ostia, again, damage observed in certain buildings can only be explained by an earthquake's lateral seismic waves. In the image shown, you can see an example where the outer semi-arc of a wall was pushed outward due to horizontal seismic stress. And this force caused cracks to form in a specific rupture pattern. The external crack originated at the bottom of the wall, while the internal crack followed weaker mortar joints, so dividing the wall into two distinct segments, one a rotational wedge and the other one a slip wedge. And these distinctive patterns are clear indicators of seismic damage in our cases. And this kind of patterns also helps us to determine the degree of vulnerability in different types of structures and how communities may have adapted their building practices in response to earthquake threats over time. However, interpreting cultural markers of earthquakes in the archaeological record is not always straightforward. While the evidence is of course valuable, it is rarely conclusive on its own. It often requires cross-referencing with other data sources, such as historical text or better geological evidence, to reach more robust conclusions about the impact of these earthquakes. So for this, the third category of data we have is geological, which requires interdisciplinary collaboration for effective analysis. And geological data can include geomorphological analysis. This identifies fault lines, tectonic activity, and landforms that indicate seismic processes, such as surface ruptures or land shifts caused by earthquakes. Like here we see on the left, for example, the fault line is visible. On the left is marked by a steep east-west striking, south-dipping normal fault scarp, which forms the shear back wall of the sanctuary at the Perakora Herayon in the eastern Gulf of Corinth. Then we have the sedimentological examination. Features like tsunami deposits, for example, help strengthen the hypothesis about the earthquake-induced phenomena, and it offers up also valuable evidence of this kind of impacts. Here, for example, of the geological evidence, in the middle we see a tsunami deposit at the promontory of Palekastro in Crete in Greece. There is a multimodal chaotic deposit of stone slabs with indications of strong water flows. And we also see the wall plaster, ceramic sherds, some cattle bones. And on the right, we have another tsunami deposit where we see volcanic Santorini ash, a marine shell, stones, and pottery sherds. And the 14C dating confirms that it is from an eruption that occurred in the Minoan Santorini, which caused later also an earthquake in the region. In addition to the geological analysis, other interdisciplinary methods also play an important role in archaeoseismology. These techniques are often carried out by specialists in other fields, and they provide complementary data to strengthen our understanding of seismic activity in ancient times. Here I'll briefly mention some key geophysical methods that are used in archaeoseismological studies, together with some visual examples from an earthquake that occurred in Sicily during the Roman period. So first we have the seismic refraction tomography. This technique uses seismic waves to create images of the subsurface by measuring the time it takes for the waves to travel through the ground and return to the surface. We have then electrical resistivity tomography, and by sending electrical currents through the ground, this method maps underground materials such as rocks, sediments, groundwater, faults, and it generates 2D or 3D images of the subsurface. Then we have ground penetrating radar. it uses radar pulses, and this technique images the subsurface by sending electromagnetic waves into the ground and recording the reflected signals from materials like soil, rocks, or buried objects. And at the end, we have the magnetic surveys. It's one of the techniques that is probably used the most among all in archaeology. And these surveys detect variations in Earth's magnetic field using magnetometers, and it helps identify subsurface features and also locate archaeological structures. Of course, the applicability of these methods depend heavily on the characteristics of the area. In places with repeated settlements over time, layers of occupation can overlap or disturb earlier features, and this makes it harder to produce clear and reliable results. On the other hand, in areas with less frequent or more sparse settlements, the ground is often less disturbed, so the earlier features are better preserved. And this allows geophysical methods to detect and map remains more effectively, and it produces a cleaner and more reliable data that we can use. But how do we interpret this data, right? Once the data is collected, what do we do? Once the data is collected, it must be, in our case at least, it must be interpreted within a temporal, spatial, and cultural framework to understand the full scope of seismic events and also their impact on ancient communities. So this process involves a temporal analysis, establishing a timeline for seismic events and correlating it with archaeological and historical records to understand when these earthquakes may have occurred. Then we have the spatial analysis, by mapping the distribution of the seismic impacts across the sites and its surroundings, which allows us also to identify these patterns of damage. We try to see how different areas have responded to them. Then we have a cultural analysis where we evaluate how these events influence the cultural practices, the urban planning, and structures, which provides insight into how communities adapted socially and culturally. To confirm that the identified phenomena result really from the seismic events, we must cross-reference geological and archaeological findings with independent data sources too. So this includes, if needed, radiocarbon dating to refine the chronological framework and verify the timing of the events, such as this tsunami deposit that we have seen, for example. Investigating these geomorphological anomalies, such as displaced strata, for example, and compare them with the historical earthquakes records to establish some sort of correlations, and assessing the social impact by analyzing how communities rebuilt or modified their environments in response to the seismic challenges. This may be reflected in changes to settlement patterns, building techniques, and material culture. So this methodology basically bridges the gap between the physical evidence that we have from the seismic events and the cultural transformations they prompted. So we seek not only to identify when and where the earthquakes occurred, but also to understand the identities, how the identities of these communities affected were shaped in a way. Archaeoseismology and identity studies are closely connected, and they show that these seismic events do more than altering only the landscape. They also transform the communities, like not only physically, but socially, culturally as well. When an earthquake strikes, communities must rebuild, they must adapt their environment. They often introduce maybe innovative approaches for construction, for materials, for urban design. And these changes are born out of necessity, but eventually they become a part of communities' cultural identity. So the seismic events can also influence at times power structures and social roles too. New leaders may emerge during recovery, and shifts in alliances and hierarchies may reshape also the social order. Communities may create rituals, memorials, or monuments to commemorate the disaster. So basically reinforcing a shared identity based on dealing the same challenges. Here, for example, we see that when Rhodos was struck by a massive earthquake in around 227, 226 BC, a lot of neighboring kingdoms sent them financial support and resources to help them rebuild the city, which eventually was one of the main reasons why Rhodos could survive as an important center of commerce and naval power throughout the Hellenistic period. It did not only help them, it did not only help the kingdoms to strengthen their political alliances, but also gave them the opportunity to demonstrate their wealth and power. So archaeoseismological evidence work alongside identity studies to reveal these changes, how these changes reflect broader cultural and social transformations. Here we can also read it together. Hero Angelo, for instance, presented them with 75 talents of silver. That's a lot in the ancient times. Part at once, and the rest at a very short interval as a contribution towards the expenses of the gymnasium. Gave them for religious purposes some silver cauldrons and their stands and some water vessels. And in addition to this, 10 talents for their sacrifices and 10 more to attract new citizens. Their intention being that the whole present should amount to 100 talents. So we see also that the connection between earthquakes and identity also extend to religious thought. In the ancient world, natural disasters were often seen as messages from the gods. Earthquakes, floods, other calamities were interpreted as signs of divine anger and intervention, as scientific explanations, of course, were not yet available at that time, right? So it's in response, communities often built their temples, they erected statues, they performed rituals to appease these deities. They also seek some sort of protection, some sort of forgiveness from them. For example, Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea and also earthquakes, was frequently depicted wielding a trident, the one you see here. And according to the myth, when Poseidon struck the earth, earthquakes would follow. So in a way, it symbolized both the power of natural forces and the cultural frameworks of how people used to understand this kind of things. Temples dedicated to Poseidon and also other deities, along with literary references such as this Prometheus bound from Achilles, show the spiritual and cultural significance of how ancient communities interpreted these major events. And as it says, Poseidon spared that scourge of the sea and the shaker of the land. So when it comes to my postdoctoral project, this project is part of the ongoing initiative Beyond History, Natural Calamities and Archaeology at the Department of Mediterranean Archaeology at the University of Bern under the guidance of Professor Mango. And today I will briefly outline the current state of the research, at least my part, its objective, and what kind of outcomes do we expect from this study. So we'll begin now with Lipari. Lipari is one of the Aeolian Islands, and the Aeolian archipelago consists of 7 main islands in the area: Lipari, Salina, Vulcano, Stromboli, Filicudi, Alicudi, and Panarea, and they are located in the southern Tyrrhenian Sea, just a little bit north of Sicily. And in addition, there are several smaller uninhabited islands and rocky outcrops around too, and Lipari is located right there. The island group lies on the Tindari fault system. here you see it better, marked in red, and they form a volcanic arc. And due to this geological setting, the Aeolian Islands have been recognized since the antiquity for their seismic and also volcanic activity. And although ancient travelers and authors frequently mentioned this natural phenomena here, systematic archaeological and geological research on the islands only began in the 20th century, with early work focusing on mainly Lipari and Salina. And investigations became more comprehensive during and after the Second World War, and they eventually spanned over 5 decades. So this extensive research led also to the establishment of the Aeolian Archaeological Museum in 1954, and by 2000, the Aeolian Islands were designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But you may ask, there are so many islands, why Lipari and why not the other islands? Lipari is an ideal case to study for several reasons, actually. First, an easy guess, it's the largest island in the archipelago. It covers around 3,760 hectares. Second, systematic excavations began here in 1948. So it provides a rich archaeological record compared to the other islands, at least. And this findings shows that habitation from the Neolithic period onwards we can follow it. And during the Bronze Age, settlements grew even more, thanks to also to the wealth that came from the rich obsidian sources they had in the island. And this wealth also supported that they could trade the obsidian. And it persisted until the Roman imperial times. Archaeological remains have been found across the island, majorly in the points I have shown in red. What makes though Lipari particularly interesting is the evidence of a sudden settlement abandonment in the around 9th to 6th century BC, which is likely caused by natural disasters. According to the archaeological excavations done in the 70s, from approximately 900 to 580 BC, the Aeolian Islands, including Lipari, were nearly empty. And the archaeological findings indicate a significant, a sharp decline in human activity during that era. So until the Greeks arrived to establish a colony here, there was basically almost no one left. In addition to this, we also have the ancient authors' texts that support this hypothesis. In 580 BC, the Greeks arrived on Lipari, according to Pausanias, to the islands called Aeolus at that time. They were empty. There were no one. On the other hand, according to Diodorus Siculus, the local community founded by Aeolus was reduced to only 500 people. So the Greeks were welcomed amicably and they persuaded by the natives to settle. And while the archaeological research agrees more with Pausanias that it was completely empty, regardless, it's clear that there have been a demographic crisis somewhere around 9th to 6th century BC in the island. And then we know that in the subsequent Greek and Roman periods, thanks to the archaeological material remains that we have, that the islands experienced then consistent growth. Also, thanks to the wealth they had from the obsidian and the strong communities that were there. So building on this historical context, my research focused on 3 main questions: the settlement chronology, when were the settlements established, and when were they abandoned exactly, and can we pinpoint instances where abandonment was really triggered by the natural disasters? Then, of course, continuity and change. How have the settlement patterns evolved over time in response to these environmental challenges? The third one is the cultural adaptation. How did the inhabitants of Lipari adapt to natural disasters through changes in urban planning, in mobility, and cultural practices? So one can imagine that people also felt maybe obligated to return to Lipari due to these abundant deposits of high quality obsidian. Because evidence also suggests that obsidian in Lipari was mined as early as the Neolithic period, and it was an important center of production and trade until at least the Bronze Age. And then we know that it still continued. So the island's economy likely depended heavily on this valuable resource. And over time, obsidian became more than a commodity. Likely it formed also an important part of the community's identity through its role in social organization. So it's also a perspective I will keep working on during this research. So the anticipated outcomes of this research will include developing a detailed open access temporal, special and cultural database of Lipari. Also that it gives us the chance to compare the data together with Northern Sicily, understanding how these natural disasters shaped the island's history, and also trying to gain information into how communities responded to and managed to these challenges over time, also providing some hopefully valuable lessons for addressing modern environmental crises. So earthquakes have historically led to significant demographic shifts, often also forcing migration, at times facilitating the exchange of cultural practices. And at the same time, the environmental pressures caused by seismic events combined with changing climatic conditions, it pushed the communities to develop new approaches to construction, to resource management, to social organization. So these events show how identity is shaped when communities face crisis. And by examining how these societies adapted to this crisis, we gain a better understanding into contemporary challenges too, such as climate-induced migration and the need for social environmental resilience. So in conclusion, societies, both past and present, are shaped by the forces of nature. Environmental pressures influence where people settle, how they adapt, innovate, rebuild in response to adversity. And these studies offer also critical insights into addressing the uncertainties of, let's say, today's world in a way. As we face modern environmental crisis, the resilience demonstrated by past societies also reminds us our capacity for adaptation and, in a way, survival. So their experiences not only provide practical lessons, but also challenge us to reconsider our relationship with the environment. Thank you.